So, I find myself more and more in the last couple of months or so having to come and having to make videos about things that I normally don't even talk about all that much, simply because the messages that are being put across are making things worse for good people in this country. And it's time that someone has to stand up and remind some people of some things and maybe teach people some things. So for whatever reason, this has been put in my lap to do this. So I'm having to do this today. Um, I grew up in the South. Nashville, Tennessee was where I spent most of my time. Lived a little bit in Virginia, and of course, being a white person and being in a public school where it was 40% other races besides white people, it was natural to be taught without fail that everything that ever happened in the past was that was racial related, um, as a result of or has something to do with slavery, as far as like the all the negative things and that have happened in this country, race related things. And of course, the biggest thing that we're taught in public schools, and it's the assumption that even a lot of um, people on the right, like PragerU is advancing this idea. There are other people on the right that believe this. I mean, this has been so ingrained. It's kind of like how people just automatically believe that there were dinosaurs 60 million years ago. Dinosaurs had to have lived at the same time with man, because there's only been life on this earth for a small, tiny fraction of that 60 million years. But the quote unquote scientists will tell you, yeah, no, there's 60 million years ago. We've all been conditioned to believe that it was 60 million years or more ago. And it's the same thing with this idea that the Civil War was fought over slavery. Now, before I get going, please understand that I am not here to promote any sort of white supremacy or racism or anything. I'm not ashamed of being a Caucasian person. I'm not ashamed of being a Caucasian person who had ancestors who probably fought in the Civil War on the side of the South. The issue there in the South was way more complex. The issue in that war was between the North and the South was way more complex than this quantification or whatever the word is, where people are saying, "Oh, it was all about slavery." The Southern people hated black people. The Northern people loved black people. The North got sick and tired of slavery, so they ran over there and heroically just defeated the South and freed the slaves. And that's what we've been taught, and that's what we're still being taught. Uh, that's really not the case, and I'm sorry if to burst your bubble, but it is not the case here. Okay, here's the deal. The Civil War was not fought over slavery. Slavery was a catch cause, kind of like the Black Lives Matter movement now has got their catch cause. I can't breathe, get off my neck, hands up, don't shoot. And everybody that's the whole country is just being destroyed by this group of people because they believe that it's something we deserve for all this terrible terrible treatment of by the police of the black people in our nation. They say, well, black people are being hunted down and just killed by police officers, and it's just happening all over the place. Millions and millions of lives are being destroyed by these police. And defund the police and get rid of the police. And the actual statistics and the actual facts don't even come close to what they're saying about this. And so that's what slavery was in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s, 1850s, 60s, whatever. Slavery was the catch. It was the pet issue of the day. Yes, there were slaves. Absolutely, slavery was evil. Absolutely, it should never have happened. Absolutely, the slaves deserve to be freed. Okay, I'm not going to mince words on that. But the war itself was not fought about slavery. It was fought about two things, which in actuality are only one thing: money and power. Which in actuality is basically the same thing, because the people who have the money have the power, and vice versa. That's what the main issue was in the war between the North and the South in 1860s, 50s, and 60s. That was the real reason why there was a civil war. Yeah, let me explain. The South had a large amount of outdoor working slaves. They were the ones that were picking all the different kinds of cash crops. They were taking care of the cattle. They were producing things, and a large portion of their labor force, not all of it, but a large portion was West African slaves, black people. They were getting filthy rich off of the backs of these slaves. Now, in the North, you had slaves, but the vast majority of them were indoor workers, cooks, maids, housekeepers, babysitters, um, you know, uh, street workers, carriage drivers, whatever. People, they were more like, like your modern servants are now, except for they weren't getting paid and they had no rights. But that was basically what the North had. They had slaves. They just did, their slaves weren't making any money for them. Their slaves weren't, their slavery that they had there was not a big issue because it wasn't, it was just like if you didn't have the slaves, you could just hire somebody for, pay them $3 a month or whatever it was back then, and they could do the same job. So the slavery there wasn't as big of an issue as it was in the South. So the North decided that the South, because the South is making so much money and making so much of a profit off of these slaves, they thought it would be best for them to get more of that money. They wanted to raise the taxes. They wanted to take more tariffs, more fees. They wanted the South to pay up because they didn't feel like the South. They felt like the South was making too much money and they weren't getting their cut. The seat of power in Washington and wherever else, they weren't getting their cut. Just like now, um, when people find ways to save money and whatever, and they find ways to make more money, and get richer. What happens? The people in the North, the seat of power, Washington and the IRS and whoever else, they find some way to take more of your money. Now, granted, again, I will reiterate that slavery was absolutely evil. Nobody should have had slaves. The North shouldn't have had them. The South shouldn't have had them. They shouldn't have been slaves. But the issue was not slaves. The issue was money. So the North says, we're going to start charging you more taxes and more fees and more tariffs because you're making too much money. You're getting rich. And who does that sound like today? The people that are occupying, what's the name of that place? Seattle. That little place where everybody's occupying Seattle. They want everything to be free. They want to redistribute the wealth, is what they call it. That kind of sounds like them. And so the North says, you're going to give us more money. The South says, no, we're not. So they begin to squabble. A battle ensues, and pretty soon they're in a civil war. So what does the leader of the North do? The leader of the North, by the name of Abraham Lincoln, what does he do? Well, he says, what's the best way to destabilize them so that we can have more control over them and finally get what we want from them? And of course, the one thing he could think of, and the one thing that was the most likely choice, was to quote unquote free the slaves. So he about a year after the Civil War began, which you'd think if he really wanted to free the slaves, he would have freed them as soon as he got into office. He wouldn't have waited until a year after the Civil War was raging. So about a year after the Civil War has been going on, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, frees the slaves. But it only works on the slaves in the South. It's only for them, and it doesn't really free them. I mean, it makes them legally free, but it doesn't really free them because the Southern people, they're already in a war with the North, so they're not going to pay attention to anything that the North does, anything that North issues, any Emancipation Proclamation or anything else. But the slaves in the South get wind of this. The abolitionists get wind of this. They say, "Oh, we finally got something legal behind us to do this." So they start the Underground Railway. They start, smuggling slaves into the North, and all these different things, and it destabilizes the South's finances. It destabilizes their wealth. It They eventually basically just their movement, their war just dies out. Then they lose the war. They have to surrender. Lee surrenders, and the war is over. And it worked. It did exactly what Lincoln wanted it to do. Meanwhile, back in the North, the slaves that were there in the North doing the inside work, the yard work, the maids and the butlers and the carriage drivers and whatever they were, whatever they did, they're still doing the same jobs. They're still doing exactly what they were doing before. They weren't freed. They were reclassified as servants, given some sort of a pittance, some sort of a small amount of money. They had no rights. They had no freedom. They were not allowed to be educated. They were not allowed to own land. Nothing. They were completely. They were exactly what they were before. They just had a little money to spend if they wanted to. So for a long time after the war, the northern slaves remained there. They just weren't called slaves anymore. Back in the South, the former slaves that were working the land where they had been slaves before, they were given little, plots of land to work. They sharecropped. They traded the crops in for ownership of the land. They began to own land. Things were actually a lot better for them after, the people like the Klan and all those guys kind of calmed down a little bit. Things were actually a lot better for the black people in the South than they were in the North for a long time, until this Jim Crow thing happened and it got bad for them again. Granted, they weren't equal. Granted, they didn't have anywhere near as many rights as the white people did. But compared to the way things were in the North for a very long time, it was better. But here's the thing. People keep on saying that the reason that they had that war was the fact that the North hated slavery and wanted all the slaves free, and the South loved slavery and wanted to keep the slaves, and in the South were a bunch of racists, and in the North were these great liberators. It's absolutely false. There were probably more abolitionists in the South than there were in the North. Um, the Northern president, the president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, said very plainly that he did not disagree with slavery. He disagreed with a person having to work a day's wage or a day's labor without getting a wage for it, without getting a fair wage. And this is because of the way he was treated when he was a child and a young adult by his father. To say that it was about slavery is ignorant as saying to today's riots are about George Floyd. They're not about George Floyd. They're about power. They're about money. They're about power. They're about who gets to have free money and who gets to be taxed. And they're using these things just like the North did in those days. They were using slavery as an excuse. The same thing is happening today. We're being told that every white person is responsible for all the terrible things that happened to black people all throughout the years. People like me and you who've never owned a slave, we've never had we've never mistreated black people or anything. We're being told that we are racist, and the only way we can stop being racist is if we give in to the political movement and become Marxists, and that's basically what they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to make the United States into a Marxist nation. So people need to learn from the past. They need to stop just regurgitating what they were taught in grade school by their state-owned, state-paid teachers, and start learning, doing research, learning. Was slavery bad? Absolutely. Should it have been? Had it existed? No, absolutely not. And there's still slavery today, but history is often written by people who won a war or won a battle against others based on falsehoods and false information. And it's almost always the underlying reason for everything that happens like these wars and these battles and these riots and everything. The underlying issue is almost always greed. Who has the power? Who has the money? Who wants it? And the people that want your money, your property, your land, your life. Those people are using whatever they can at their disposal to make that a reality. They don't care about black lives. They don't care about George Floyd. They don't care about you. All they care about is power. Same thing that in the North in the Civil War. They didn't care about black people. They didn't care about the slaves. They didn't care about freedom. All they cared about is winning their war so that they could get what they wanted. It was all about greed. It was money and greed. And uh, uh, if it had been about black people, if it had been about slaves, there would have been. See, the thing is that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually help the black people. It made things worse for them because they were mistreated more because of the Emancipation Proclamation. What they should have done is they should have just said, okay, um, slavery's wrong. Here's what we want you to do. We want to help you get out of the need for slavery so that you can let your slaves go and they can become citizens. They can have rights and they can own land and they can be educated and whatever. We want to help them by helping you, or help you by so you can help them, and so forth. There's other ways they could have done it, but they didn't. They issued this fake proclamation that didn't do anything for anyone except them. It destabilized the South, but it didn't really help the black people, and it didn't help any of the black people in the North at all, and it helped very few of the black people in the South. All it did was make things chaotic. It made people poor, and it put a lot of very angry. It made a lot of very angry, disenfranchised white people angry at the wrong people, which was the slaves, and a lot of them were mistreated and killed and hung, and all these different things. The Emancipation Proclamation was a political tool that was used to gain power, and that's all. And gain money and power, and that's all it was. Just like the Black Lives Matter movement, just like the Antifa, those guys don't care about black lives. They don't care about justice and peace. If they wanted justice and peace, they wouldn't be running around breaking everything and pulling people out of cars, killing children. None of that stuff. It was about justice and peace. It's not. It's about the same two things that the slave or the Southern or the Civil War was about: money and power. That's it. That's all it's ever been. That's all most wars are about, especially those two, especially the Civil War and this thing that's happening now. Don't be fooled by the state. Don't let the state think for you. Find the answers yourself. Do the research. Go back and look at the popular literature of the day. Go back and read the correspondences between Washington and other people. Go back and look at what Abraham Lincoln wrote in his journals. Go back and read what the slaves were saying. Look at all the videos and the books that were written by former slaves. See what they thought of the situation. It's not as cut and dry. It's not as plain and simple. It's not as black and white, quote unquote, as everybody wants you to believe it is. There's a lot more complex. So think for yourself. Don't be a tool. Don't be used for the glory of the state. Don't let your freedom go away because you're afraid that somebody might call you a racist or whatever. Be your own person. All right. Bye.